their great coach, Jerome Stempfenagel, whose name hasn't been mentioned yet today, but should be. Maybe he saw the handwriting on the wall, and he moved on north to Lapel, thank you. So my dad was left into higher P. And it was one of the craziest things. My dad was not a crazy man at all. He's probably one of the most sane men on the planet. Sanity, there's in the dictionary definition of sanity, there's my dad's picture next to it. And conservatism. So hiring Pete Gill was not in character for my dad. And that was one of the most interesting aspects of the whole story to me from the very beginning. How can my dad hire Pete Gill? Because they really are very different, come from different planets. But at the same time, I also know my dad to be a person who really is attracted to, finds appealing, very passionate individuals who believe in what they're doing and invest their whole being in something and stick their neck out. Sometimes take enormous risks. And that's what Pete Gill was. You know, he was nothing if not that kind of individual. He was willing to go full tilt towards what he was after and not hold anything back. I think Dad recognized that in the interview, and of course, you know, the rest is history from that interview. Well, the process, I don't want to, you know, retell the book, obviously, but I feel like I need to explain a little bit about why it did take so long to get to this point, why it did take 10 years. And I had that year of sabbatical, 2003, 2004, where I did all the research and the interviewing. I went to Indianapolis and spent days in the library, the state library up there, looking at statistics all over the state about small schools throughout the state and the history of Indiana basketball. Spent days in the Jasper Library, many days in the Jasper Library, days in the Washington Library and the Evansville Library. Those particular libraries, and thanks to the librarians, if there are any of those here today, for the help that they gave me in the process. Very helpful along the way. At the end of that year, I had lots of notes, and I had to structure what I had. I had recorded almost all of the interviews that I had done, and I tried to arrange the material in a pattern that made sense, you know, collecting comments about Pete, for example, together, and games, summaries, and together, and those kinds of things, so that I could then structure it and start writing it, which I did then in the summer of 2004, start to write it. And it took me a couple of years to produce a draft of 150,000 words. By the end of 2006, I had 150,000 words drafted at that point. Writing almost entirely in my spare time. I was still teaching full-time, a full load at the UC Blue Ash campus. And there isn't a whole lot of time for a two-year college professor to write outside of teaching and grading papers, let me tell you. So most of my writing time had to come in the summer when I might have a month free of teaching. But I got 150,000 words written, and I knew I was under the gun too with people who were moving on in years and in not great health, and wanted to get this thing out there before everybody was gone. So I presented it, or submitted the manuscript at that point. 150,000 words is a pretty hefty book, and submitted it to Indiana University Press, which from the day one was the publisher that I wanted to publish the book. This was an Indiana basketball story, even though I think it has broader appeal than that. I thought it really deserved to be published by Indiana University Press, and Linda Oblak, the editor there, I think did believe in the story from the beginning. She was a 1964 graduate of a small school up near Valparaiso. I've forgotten the name of it now, but she lived through that time period in a small town and believed in everything that this story was about, recapturing that era, which is, as Dell said, gone. You know, it is gone. We won't see that that kind of world again. It just won't happen. So she believed in it, but you know, the process when you submit a manuscript like that to a university, they'll have reviewers, and Don Diker was one of the reviewers of the second go-around. But in this first go-around, I wish you had been a reviewer the first go-around. Well, maybe I don't, because actually the book really wasn't ready to be published then. It was hurried and not as good as it could be. The style was inconsistent. It was too big, even though, you know, I wanted to include everything in there, that all the great stories that everybody had to tell me along the way. But the reality is that's going to be too big a book for most people, and so you had to ultimately, sadly, cut some of that back. But at that point, it was all there, and they farmed it out to some reviewers at that point, and they got a thumbs up from one of them, and they were waiting for another one. They said, we need one more, and then we'll go to the editorial board with it, and it'll be a go to publish the book. And so I was waiting, and I waited, and I waited, and the months passed, and I would send them emails and say, well, I haven't heard anything, you know, what's going on? And they said, well, we're still waiting. There's a certain person who has a manuscript. We're waiting on him to give us his review. And 15 months passed. This was from 2007 into March of 2008. In the meantime, I got involved heavily in other writing projects that occupied my time. One of them was the reaccreditation report for the college. I was on the writing committee for that, and that produced a 300-page tome also. I don't recommend you read that, by the way. That's not something you would want to read, but it did occupy a great amount of my time. And we were waiting on this person who happens to be a pretty well-known sports writer in Indiana. I'm not going to give his name, but I guess he's probably retired now, but
You can tell him what I said, though. And I told him.
You want to tell him, without saying his name?
I will. Mike had told me that this particular writer, who is good, I mean, there's, you know, hey, everything's opinions, right? I mean, but Mike had told me that he had more or less rejected the project as being viable. I happened to be up at the Indiana Basketball Hall of Fame 10 days ago, and I saw this man, and I said, hey, how you doing? I didn't say his name. You know, the book that Mike Roos is writing about Ireland? Yeah. Yeah, well, I'm going down, that book's being launched in about 10 days. I'm going to go down to Ireland speaking at it. It's really a good book. He kind of looked bewildered.
I'm looking forward to him reading it. Yeah, he gave it thumbs down. I ultimately got his review, and here's what he said. He said, first of all, he said, I took so long to read it. At one point, he claimed that he lost the manuscript. But then when he said, he finally got around to reading it, but he said, I just didn't want to read it. I did not want to read it because, he said, every small town in Indiana has a story like that. That's what he said without reading it. And, you know, and I know, and I think those of you who have lived it know it for sure, that's not true. That not every small town in Indiana has a story like this one. Even those that did have success don't have a story like this one. This one is a special combination of unique individuals, very special individuals, I think, that I got to know. I knew a little bit, you know, growing up here as, you know, as an 11-year-old. I knew a little bit then, but I didn't realize how special they really were until I hung out with them at the 40th anniversary in 2003 and played golf with some of them, and it was spent a weekend with them, and I said, this really does need to be told. This story does, and I had the year ahead coming, the sabbatical coming up, and so it was calling to me. This was my calling, you know, to do this book. I'm convinced of that. So, but you know, I do thank Mr. X for rejecting the book. Really, ultimately, it's unfortunately, but don't thank him for the delay in terms of not being able to get it finished for those people that aren't here with us. But that certainly motivated me to really write it absolutely as well as I possibly could, and really give it the justice that it really deserves. But it took me another few years before I was able to get back to it. Hemingway Research got involved in there as well, and so it wasn't until the summer of 2011 where I was able then to start the rewrite. And I knew it had to be shorter. I knew it had to be tighter and more compact, and I wanted it to be a story where the characters really lived and breathed on the page, and that's why I chose to write it as a creative nonfiction rather than a straight history of that period. I use some of the techniques of fiction in recreating dialogue, and so yeah, those are the parts that obviously I wasn't there with a tape recorder recording conversations that are in the book, but I hope captured the spirit, because I did, you know, listen to these guys talk and hear their voices and spent hours with them, and I hope the dialogue captures them as real people, and that was what I was trying to do, was to write a book that I would want to read, and that some of what I felt about these people would come through you, the reader, in the process. So the book then was finally finished, or nearly finished, I guess. It was finished enough to resubmit to IU. Linda Oblak was still there, and I sent her an email. I briefly considered self-publishing, but I said, well, no, I'm going to send it back to IU again and tell them, or I'm at least going to ask them if they were interested in reading it again, the rewrite. And so I sent her an email, and she said, just like that, she said, send it. And it just from the very beginning of that process felt very different from the previous experience, and the vibes were good. And I submitted in March of 2012, just a year ago last March, and by May I got a thumbs up that they were going to accept it and offer me a contract in 2012 with one caveat. The manuscript that I submitted to them had been cut from 150,000 words to 125,000. I thought, okay, that's a good length. But the editorial board said, no, we want another 10,000 words cut. So I did have to go back in that summer of 2012 and cut another 10,000 words from it, that was the real tough one, the real tough cut. But I did tighten up some of the dialogue at that point again. And then there was one final revision. Last March, I had made some of the book available. Some of you may have read it, the first chapter online. And I heard some comments from people that weren't very happy with some of the profanity that I had put in there. And of course, as I've talked to the people that lived through that era, I was making a serious effort to be realistic, because people did use those words. But on the page, it did leap out at you a little bit, so I did make some final revisions to tone down some of that. And I didn't want the book to be banned in the Ireland Elementary School here of all places anyway. So I think it's a book that anybody can read at any age, and enjoy it, and get to know these wonderful people and this wonderful story that I know that I'll carry with me for the rest of my life.